thank you for coming. Welcome to the second edition of the Hantho Lecture on Responsible Leadership. This is the first time we do a live broadcast, so bear with us. My name is Joey Matheson. I am the president of the Engineering Student Society. I'm a fourth-year petroleum engineering student and hope to one day be a leader in the Canadian energy industry. Today we'll have a live conversation. I encourage you to use the chat, ask your questions, and make comments during the presentation. The questions will be monitored and relayed to the stage. We'll spend the second half of our presentation doing a Q&A. When I was asked to MC the lecture today, I was hesitant. Last year, Fraser Forbes, the Dean of Engineering, was in my spot. And I said, no, I can't do it. He's much more wise and experienced. Let him do it again. And they pushed. And I declined again, and I said, no, he'll do a much better job. And finally, they were straight with me. They said, Joey, we're not looking for a better public speaker. We're looking for someone that's a little better looking. So it is my pleasure to introduce Fraser Forbes, the Dean of Engineering.
I'm thinking you got it backwards, Joey. You're the wise one. I'm the better looking one. So, thank you, first of all, for the thoughtful intro, but more so for the leadership that you and the whole ESS team has shown in supporting our students and me during a particularly challenging time. For 112 years, the engineering in Alberta has been dedicated to providing extraordinary engineering education and exceptional experiential learning opportunities for our students. We've been doing groundbreaking, high-impact research that's played a crucial role in shaping our province and our country. We are, of course, most proud of our graduates, many of whom have become outstanding leaders. Charles Hantho is one of these. Chuck started at CIL as an engineer. CIL was Canadian Industries Limited in the past, and he rose at CIL to the president and CEO position. When CIL was bought out by an international company, ICI, Chuck moved to Dominion Textiles as the president and CEO, and then rose to board chair. Then, because he'd only worked in the chemical industries and the textile industries, he decided to expand his horizons and worked in the steel industry as the board chair at Dofasco. And since then, he's been on many boards of directors and recognized with many awards, among them the Order of Canada. Now, in the citation for the Order of Canada, it made special note of the work that he did in implementing the Responsible Care Program. This was an initiative that Chuck, along with some other leaders in the Canadian chemical industry, answered the call of some of the safety record in the 1970s and earlier for the chemical industry. And it was focused on improving the safety record for them. They developed and deployed that responsible care program throughout the chemical industry in Canada. And what was different about it is they didn't look at the work practices so much, the workplace safety. They tried to drive a full life cycle safety commitment in each company. It actually transformed our chemical industry to become among the safest and a safety leader for the world. The program was so successful that it was copied in the US and the UK. Chuck's commitment to responsible leadership and to our engineering students motivated him to create the Charles H. Hantho Fund in Responsible and Sustainable Engineering. This is the fund that supports this lecture series. It brings engineering business leaders to speak with our community, leaders who help us explore what it means to be a responsible leader. Chuck, thank you for supporting this lecture, and moreover, thank you for all you do for us.
Thank you, Fraser. I have to agree. I might be the more wise one. I'm not sure if I agree on the better looking statement. And boy, am I excited. We are about to jump into our presentation. During the presentation, we encourage you to use the chat. We will monitor the questions and the comments and use them for the Q&A period in about 25 minutes. It is now time for me to introduce you to the legend, Hal Kvisle. If you Google Hal, you won't know where to start. The internet has so many great things to say. When sharing with my network that I was doing this, the word was unanimous. Hal is a trailblazer. He's an outstanding Albertan leader who has always remained authentic, wise, caring, and always standing up for doing the right thing. Hal was born in Kvisle, Alberta. He got an engineering degree from the U of A, and he holds an MBA from the University of Calgary. Hal has more than 40 years of experience in the energy sector, including exploration, development, production, pipelines, and power generation. He's led multiple publicly traded companies as president and CEO, such as Talisman and TC Energy. Through his retirement, if you can call it a retirement when you're working so hard, Hal sits on many boards and is board chair of ARC Resources Limited and Finning International Incorporated. He is also the founding chair of the Business Council of Alberta and the former chair of the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America, the former chair of the Mount Royal College Board of Governors, and the former chair of the Nature Conservancy of Canada. There are so many great things you can say about Hal, but I must keep coming back to this. Hal is a trailblazer. It is now my privilege to introduce you to this year's Hantho Lecture Series speaker, Mr. Hal Kvisle.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind introduction and sometimes don't know what to say in response to all of those accolades. I'll just take it in course and thank you for the kind words. It's a real honor and a pleasure for me to be here to speak on responsible leadership and what that means for people in Alberta today and for people in the engineering profession and for those of us that are supporters of the University of Alberta. And today I'm going to speak primarily on responsible leadership with respect to the challenge of energy infrastructure development in Canada and some of the challenges that face us in Alberta and here in our energy industry that has been so important to the building of this great province. As was mentioned, I was born and grew up in Kvisle, Alberta, and I was fortunate to graduate with a degree in civil engineering from the University of Alberta in 1975. And when Dean Forbes mentioned that engineering has been part of the University of Alberta for over 100 years, I thought to myself, gee, you know, that's 50 years ago, halfway through that whole history that I started in engineering in 1970. At the time, I had no idea that an engineering degree would open the door to remarkable career adventures and opportunities. Graduating from the University of Alberta in engineering was, in fact, one of the great events of my life as I look back on things. And for that reason, I'm here today to speak about future opportunities that U of A engineering graduates can look forward to, and particularly the role they can play in leadership in our province and our society today. Specifically, I want to speak about opportunities in the energy sector where career opportunities certainly are not as popular or as plentiful today as they were just a few years ago. Predictions are out there today that Alberta's energy sector will be dead and gone within 10 or 15 years, that we will phase out the oil sands and that hydrocarbons will not have a place to play in the broader economy in the years ahead. I disagree with that, and I'm going to speak about that today and comment a little bit about what the great opportunities that still exist for us in Alberta and will continue to exist for decades to come. The upstream energy sector is not only the largest employer of technical professionals in Alberta, it's also the largest and most successful industrial sector in all of Canada today. Not just the largest in Alberta, the largest in all of Canada. Non-industrial sectors, including real estate development and ownership, and the healthcare sector, are by some measures larger than the energy industry, but those are not industrial sectors. They're not primary drivers of the underlying economy. Auto manufacturing, forest products, mining, and the so-called high-tech software sector are important, but not one of those industries is 1/10 as large as Canada's energy industry is today. In this relatively bottom of the cycle year that we're in right now, energy sector investment in Western Canada will only be about $30 billion. We will only spend about $30 billion drilling and developing oil and gas wells and building production facilities. That's much less than the $80 billion per year that we spent, for example, in 2014 and a couple of years before that. Even so, the $30 billion that we'll invest in 2020 will, and $40 billion that the industry is looking to invest next year, will dwarf the growth investments of any other industrial sector in our country today. Now, it's clear that energy and Alberta are confronted with many challenges. Environmental activists have singled out Canada's energy sector as a global villain, even though we operate to higher environmental standards than virtually any of our global competitors. Aggressive media campaigns have convinced many Canadians that we need to phase out the oil and gas sector. More recently, environmental activists have convinced the Trudeau government to pass legislation that dramatically and severely impacts our ability to access both North American and export markets for the oil and gas that we produce here. And perhaps most troubling and most difficult in the years ahead will be the precedent that Canada's courts have set, creating great uncertainty around the requirements for free, prior, and informed consent by Indigenous parties. And that's to the detriment of both industry and to Indigenous communities. Young Canadians do today tend to see the energy sector as a lost cause, a sunset industry where no forward-looking engineer would want to work. Interestingly, that was also a prevailing view back in 1975 when I graduated from U of A Engineering and went to work in the energy sector. People had predicted that we'd reach peak production by 1982. In fact, by 1982, we had grown production about 25%, but even today, we are producing 3 times as much as we were back in 1982. So I think the demise of the energy sector is significantly overstated. So those are some of the challenges we face, but we also have some real advantages as we look at our competitive position worldwide. We have some of the largest resource positions that you'll find anywhere in the world today, in places in the oil sands, whether it's mining operations or SAGD, and also in tight gas zones like the Montney, the Duvernay, and the Deep Basin. We have 75 years of significant production history, with perhaps the best environmental, safety, and social responsibility track record of any oil and gas producing region anywhere on Earth. We have extraordinary engineering, geoscience, and operating capabilities developed not just through education, but also through vast experience in field operations among the very best globally. We have strong financial capacity that has supported this industry over the decades, even though today that capacity is based in Toronto and is often increasingly at odds with what we want to do here in the West. And we do have citizens, residents here in Western Canada that overwhelmingly support the ongoing development and production of oil and natural gas. So notwithstanding pressure from both activists and politicians, the Canadian energy sector remains highly competitive. Canada is the world's 4th largest oil producer. Our production of about 4 million barrels a day is absolutely essential to meeting North American refinery feedstock demand. And you think about it, we're the 4th largest oil producer in the world. Try to think of one other industry where Canada's in the top 5 globally. This is actually quite a remarkable achievement that we've quadrupled our oil production in the last 25 years, and we have significant upside to grow beyond that. Only the United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia produce more oil than Canada. And just 25 years ago, most forecasters, as I mentioned, saw peak production and steady decline with few economic opportunities to grow it. Our oil production is large, and our undeveloped oil potential is an order of magnitude larger. The oil sands are an incredible resource that could sustain current rates of production for more than 150 years. That is a long life reserve. And thanks to remarkable advances in drilling and natural gas reservoir development, we now sit on almost infinite natural gas resources in the Montney and in other natural gas plays. And I believe as we look forward that the economic upside of the Montney, the Duvernay, and the Deep Basin could actually exceed the economic upside of the oil sands. As an example, consider the Montney Formation, which 10 years ago nobody talked about. It's located in northwest Alberta around Grande Prairie and up into northeast BC around Fort St. John. In earlier years in my career, I worked on developing many gas fields that had between 10 feet of pay and 100 feet of pay. If we got 100 feet of productive pay, we had a really extraordinary reservoir. Many parts of the Montney today have pay in excess of 500 feet, and some of the choice locations in the Montney have pay sections of 1,000 feet thick. This is a remarkable endowment of natural gas that we've been aware of for decades, but we could never produce it in economic quantities until horizontal fracking made it all possible. Canada could, in a world of strong demand, more than double our production of oil to more than 10 million barrels a day. We could effectively triple production from where we're at. We could also triple production of natural gas from about 16 BCF a day to more than 40 BCF a day. And we could sustain those incredible rates of production for decades. The oil sands in the Montney are each trillion-dollar assets, the only assets with that potential value of any asset position in Canada today. These are impressive resources, but they do not create value without a lot of work. We need sophisticated technologies, detailed geological assessments, thorough and complete engineering plans, and the world's most efficient operating practices to sustain and grow the energy industry in Canada. We have those remarkable human capabilities right here in Western Canada. We do import technologies and equipment from the United States, but we also export our skills and equipment south of the border and to the rest of the world. As I noted earlier, energy is still the world's largest industrial sector, and Western Canadians have proven themselves to be significant players on the global stage. Let me tell you a story from the early days of horizontal drilling and fracking in a very different environment. In the 1990s, 25 years ago, I worked for Fletcher Challenge, a global company with oil and gas operations in New Zealand, Canada, and Southeast Asia. I was in New Zealand and I visited a large offshore production platform in the hostile waters off the west coast, where our partner, Shell, was threading the drill bit into an oil reservoir that was 10,000 feet deep and more than 2,000 feet to the west of the platform. I observed a half a dozen Shell engineers in nice red coveralls and one guy in a fairly dirty pair of blue coveralls, and that guy was clearly running the operation, and I recognized a familiar accent. At a break in the action, I approached that fellow and asked him where he was from and how he ended up drilling one of the toughest offshore wells in the rough waters off New Zealand. I learned that he was a specialist, a hired gun, an expert brought in to drill very precise wells in tough circumstances. I also learned that he grew up on a farm near Kvisle, Alberta, and that his U of A engineering degree and his experience drilling horizontal wells in heavy oil plays near Lloydminster had opened the door to remarkable opportunities worldwide. And then he finished his coffee and he went back to work. Those are the kind of opportunities that have come available to Canadians all around the world. And Canadian engineers and geoscientists have left quite a mark in South America, in Russia, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and even in the offshore plays of the North Sea and elsewhere. Our technologies and expertise have been at the highest levels comparable to what you would find in Houston. Only the Americans have done more to advance the art and science of energy production than Western Canadians have, and there are 10 times as many of them. Our industry is severely challenged today, but those challenges are neither technical nor the result of opposition here in Alberta. Our challenges are downstream. We struggle to get our production to market, just as our forefathers struggled to move grain, timber, and even furs to market in earlier times. Access to market has always been a challenge for Western Canadian companies and entrepreneurs. No sector has suffered stronger and less deserved attacks and oppositions than Canada's oil and gas pipeline companies. It's amazing. We have the world's two most sophisticated and technically capable pipeline companies right here in Alberta, Enbridge and TC Energy. Not only are they highly capable, they are also larger than any pipeline companies anywhere on Earth except for one, Gazprom, the Russian giant. And despite their unequaled project development, construction, and operating capabilities, those companies face relentless opposition at every turn. Today, Enbridge struggles to complete both the Line 5 project in Minnesota and the Line 3 replacement in Michigan, and they walked away from more than $700 million spent attempting to develop Northern Gateway after the Government of Canada imposed an oil shipping blockade on the West Coast. In a similar vein, TC Energy is now concerned that construction work on Keystone XL will once again grind to a halt under President Biden after 12 years in an American regulatory quagmire created by environmental activists and supported by the Obama administration. During my time at TC Energy, we spent 7 years waiting for federal regulatory approvals for the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline. While we waited, the upstream oil and gas industry developed shale gas technology literally from scratch. Just think about that comparison. Bureaucrats endlessly mulling over a regulatory application that was fully supported by Northern Indigenous groups, while more productive engineers figured out how to drill and frack horizontal wells in tight gas reservoirs. By grinding the Mackenzie Valley project at a glacial pace, our federal regulators did exactly what the activists were hoping. They killed the project through endless delay. The Aboriginal people of the North, entitled to 1/3 ownership in that project, were the biggest losers of all. And you know the story of Energy East, a great nation-building oil pipeline project that died on the vine because of activist opposition in Quebec. Behind this relentless regulatory opposition are activists who are profoundly concerned about global warming. And I'm neither a global warming activist nor a climate denier. It's a very complex subject, and I confess I just don't know. But I recognize that greenhouse gas emissions have become a global concern, and they've in fact become part of our global culture. As a leading civilized country, Canada wants to play a leadership role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and I support that. But I strongly disagree with the approach that we're taking today. Consider Canada's actual greenhouse gas emissions compared to commitments of our federal government at Kyoto in 1996, Copenhagen in 2009, and most recently at Paris. At each of these global conferences, we committed to significant reductions. Most recently, we signed the Paris Accord, committing to even larger reductions by 2030. But we didn't come close to meeting the commitments we made at Kyoto, nor did we come close to the commitments we made at Copenhagen or at Rio, because quite frankly, we didn't have a clue about how we were going to meet those commitments when we signed up for them. Politicians thought these commitments sounded good, so they signed up. Neither Canada nor almost any other country on earth has or will meet their commitments. This is not responsible leadership to undertake those sorts of things. Canada's current Paris commitments effectively require Canada to shut down its hydrocarbon production industry, which would lead to us importing oil and gas, oil from the Middle East and natural gas from the United States. Our Prime Minister has said we need to phase out the oil sands. Does he not understand that means phasing out the largest and most valuable industry in Canada? Does he not understand that our global competitors have no intention of phasing out the 95% of global oil and gas that is not produced in Canada? I would argue that as leaders in our society and leaders in the energy sector, we need to take a different approach. Consider the following principles of a better plan. Canada's oil and gas industry directly constitutes about 10% of Canada's GDP. Phasing it out would also phase out the construction, service, real estate, and financial activities that support the oil and gas industry. Canada's overall GDP would shrink by more than 20%, and a major source of government revenues would disappear. Environment, social, and governance, the ESG agenda, is all the rage today. People talk about it. Albertans were initially defensive about ESG, but we now see it as a competitive advantage. In every respect, on the environmental, social, and governance aspects of that agenda, we are arguably the best, the cleanest, and the most responsible oil and natural gas producing region anywhere in the world. Once the world comes to recognize our outstanding ESG performance, we should really be one of the last producers standing. Canada emits about 1.5% of global man-made greenhouse gas. On the other hand, we have enormous forest cover. Our emissions per capita are among the highest in the world, but our emissions per square mile or per acre of landmass are actually the lowest in the world. Our vast forests make Canada a net absorber, not a net emitter. Canada's a large, cold country. We need to move around, and we need to heat our buildings. It's actually a matter of life and death in the middle of January. Natural gas is our cleanest option. The conversion of gasoline and diesel engines to natural gas would reduce Canadian emissions more than anything else we could do in the next 15 years. And yet today, our federal government has imposed taxes on the consumption of natural gas, which act as a direct disincentive to the kind of conversions that I've talked about. If Canadians want to be environmental leaders, we need to develop the commercial models and advanced technologies that will do that at a global scale. We can do that, and we can show the world how to do that, but it will take time, and in the meantime, I would argue, our government should take every possible step to support the conversion to natural gas and the wise economic use of our vast natural gas endowment. At a global level, the only way we will ultimately reduce greenhouse gas emissions is to reduce emissions at the individual consumer level. In the absence of a better idea, I can accept that the world needs an effective carbon tax in order to achieve reductions at the point of consumption. With respect to our trillion-dollar assets in the oil sands and the Montney, Canada might consider taking a position similar to that of Norway. The Norwegians are in fact true leaders in reducing consumer emissions, but they are quite clear that their oil and gas industry will continue to produce as long as there's global demand for oil and gas. I would argue that Canada's industrial exports should be exempt from carbon tax because our key supplier competitors do not levy carbon tax on their industries, whether it be in Russia, in Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, or even in the United States. Those other energy exports have no intention of paying carbon taxes on their production, and that puts Canadian companies at a significant disadvantage in the global export market. On the other hand, Canada's industrial imports, such as Saudi oil coming into Montreal and Pennsylvania natural gas flowing into Ontario, should pay the same carbon taxes at the burner tip as Canadian oil and gas. That is not the case today. Those come in tax-free, whereas our producers have to pay tax from the wellhead through the pipeline to the burner tip. I think our Canadian government today has created a national crisis with its stated intention to phase out the hydrocarbon industry through punitive taxation and unreasonable regulation. I've outlined a practical alternative today under which Canada would introduce a truly national carbon tax at the domestic consumer level to show the world we're serious and to set a positive example for other nations to follow. The federal government of Canada would need to recognize that we live and work in a large, cold country. Natural gas is our cleanest alternative for both transportation and heating. Nothing else can achieve the same level of greenhouse gas emission reductions, at least not in the next 15 years. Natural gas should not be subject to carbon tax. It should be, in fact, defined as the Canadian Clean Fuel Standard. Those fuels that emit more CO2 per unit of combustion than natural gas would be subject to carbon tax. And I think Canadians from coast to coast should reaffirm their support for the largest industry in our country, the oil and gas industry. We should work hard to supply the largest possible share of global energy demand in the cleanest and most responsible way. We need to recognize that our energy exporters operate in a very competitive global business environment. Our exports of oil and natural gas should be exempt from carbon tax until such time as our large global competitors impose equivalent taxes on their own production. In closing, I'd like to put this in an economic perspective. There are very few trillion-dollar asset positions in the history of global economic development. Think of the global comparables, things like the gold and diamond fields of South Africa, the oil fields of Saudi Arabia, the gas fields of Siberia, the agricultural capacity of the United States, and the copper resources of Chile. There are only two Canadian assets that meet the trillion-dollar test: the Alberta oil sands, whether through mining operations or SAGD, and the Montney rich gas deposit of northwest Alberta and northeast BC. Are we really ready and willing to phase out the two assets that we have that can compete in the trillion-dollar club around the world today? I don't think we are. Thank you for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Hal, for your remarks on responsible leadership and how our engineering students and country can be responsible leaders. Hal, I wish I had your lectures every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 12 to 12:50 p.m. I especially enjoyed your discussion on horizontal drilling and coveralls, as I'm a petroleum student. So this concludes our official presentation, but it wouldn't be a lecture without Q&A. I encourage you to keep using the chat, and we will relay your questions to the stage. But Hal, let me start by asking you, you said one of the largest challenges we're facing is getting our resources and our oil to market. What can an individual do to uphold the collective responsibility of getting our resources to market, and furthermore, becoming an industry leader in the energy sector?
Well, I think even the largest and strongest companies are made up of individuals. And the people that work in these companies can continue to do good work. They can continue to make sure that pipelines are constructed in the most responsible way, that pipelines are operated effectively, that Indigenous communities are included in the development, that we meet the highest international standards, and maybe most important, that we are an absolutely reliable supplier of crude oil and natural gas. You think about when it is 25 degrees below zero in Toronto, and that does still happen, the most important thing that TC Energy can do is make sure the gas is actually available to keep the furnaces on. And that kind of commitment to responsible reliability and absolute dependability, I think, is something that Canadians have come to take for granted. And as we as individuals work as part of larger teams, we all have to have that sense of responsibility and make sure that we can do it. I think we also, as Albertans, should play a more active role. My friend in Calgary, Kvisle, has become relatively famous for some of the comments that he's made in YouTube videos and in interviews on television. And I think Chris sets a great example, and more of us should be doing those kinds of things.
I couldn't agree more. We have a question from the audience here. How will future energy systems, natural gas and hydrogen, grow within the province? And specifically, how can universities, producers, and corporations come together to solve some of these challenges effectively?
You know, in my view, the solution to most of these economically challenged new approaches is going to be found in technology. It's always in the engineering that you figure out ways to reduce the cost. You think about where the oil sands were in 1975. Great Canadian Oil Sands was operating a money-losing operation, and Syncrude was just about to go into production. And those industries struggled mightily for 20 years until various improvements in operations were made, and it was really around the year 2000 where new ways of operating mining projects and new technologies for steam injection really revolutionized the oil sands and enabled the dramatic growth in production. Many of those technologies were developed jointly by operating companies and the universities here in Alberta. And the University of Alberta has played a very big role in the success of the oil sands. So that's how I think we'll see things move ahead. As we try to migrate from natural gas, which is CH4, to hydrogen, which is H2, what you're really doing is getting rid of one carbon atom in the CH4 molecule. And there are processes today that can do that. But they're painfully expensive. You cannot generate hydrogen that will be competitive in an economic sense with simply burning natural gas. So if your first choice, many operations today, big trucks, trains, and some heating applications are burning diesel. Well, if you can convert that diesel consumption to natural gas, you can reduce emissions by more than 50%, almost by 60%. So there's something we can do immediately today, and as we undertake that, we can then continue to work on technologies for converting that natural gas to hydrogen and eliminating emissions entirely. But all of this takes time. It takes a lot of joint work. It takes some very sophisticated engineering, technical, and scientific work at the universities, but it also takes a lot of practical, dirty hands learning out in the field by engineers that are trying to drive it through to an economic outcome. So I think there's great opportunity there, but we have to keep working at it.
You mentioned time in your lecture as well, so maybe segueing into from the technology to the political end, we have another question. How can corporations effectively develop pipelines when pipelines are a political issue? Do you see any opportunities to take pipelines out of politics or at least eliminate them as a partisan issue? Where would this change start?
I've thought about this a lot. This is a really complicated question, and the politicization of pipeline development is just a remarkable thing. When you actually think about the track record of companies like TC Energy and Enbridge and the high, extraordinary levels of reliability and the very rare instances of environmental impact, you would wonder why are the pipeline companies under attack all the time? And it's clear that they're under attack because the activists want to stop the flow of hydrocarbons from Western Canada to various refineries and other end markets. So you have to realize, I think, first of all, what we're up against. Now, I think one thing to solve the political problem that may come to pass is I can foresee that the government of Alberta, for example, will be a much more active participant in pipeline project development going forward. If we're attempting to build a pipeline through British Columbia, I could foresee the governments of Alberta and BC working out some arrangement that would be satisfactory to both provinces well in advance, and that those governments be much more heavily involved in the development of pipeline infrastructure than has been the case in the past. So I think that there are ways to get around this, but our pipeline companies are not sitting on their hands. They've learned that if they engage early with Indigenous communities, they can get the support of those Indigenous communities rather than letting the activists appeal to the Indigenous communities. And we can get them on side and they can derive substantial benefits from that. I think we've learned, in fact, that if pipeline companies engage with some of the more thoughtful activists, we can get them on side. As to what we can do with the opposition from the immovable activist, well, that's very difficult. I think we actually have to work around them. And we need to see that regulatory processes have greater logic and greater common sense to them than has sometimes been the case in the past.
Couldn't agree more. Another from the audience. U of A engineers and others will develop the technology for moving forward, such as your past examples of horizontal drilling and fracking. Sometimes it feels like it's a PR issue that we also have to meet as engineers and leaders. They would like to hear your thoughts on how we can do better on this part of the equation.
I think we can do a lot better, and I think it just means that we all have to be more actively involved in finding solutions to these things. So much of, say, take horizontal drilling and fracking. There was great concern among the public, among landowners, farmers, all kinds of people were very concerned because the story had been put out there that when you frack a horizontal well, the frack goes all the way up into the drinking water aquifers and will ruin sources of drinking water and cause gas emissions to come out of cracks in the ground and things like that. And the science behind it can clearly show that that's all absurd. These horizontal wells are fracking in reservoirs that are often 10,000 feet deep. Those fracks might go vertically up a few hundred feet, but they certainly don't go anywhere near the surface. And there's just a lot of technical reality that can be brought to bear, and some of these myths and objections that are created can be dealt with if we communicate the facts. And I think nobody's better equipped than an engineer to communicate those kind of facts. So I think we have to be a little more active than we've been in the past, and we have to be committed to getting the truth out there.
Thank you. Jumping away from the energy industry for a moment, we have a question about leadership from the audience. So how and when did you develop your personal leadership style, and what defines you as a leader?
I don't know. You know, there was no single event in the 40 years that I've worked in this business that I would say was the moment when I developed a leadership style. I think a lot of this comes together over the years, and most important, or what you learn by the examples that are set by other people. Early in my career, I worked for some remarkable people at Dome Petroleum. Dome was ultimately a failure as a company, but it was a remarkable place to work. It was one of those very large entrepreneurial organizations that would take on audacious things and actually drive them through to completion. It's too bad the financial result wasn't better. That was due to some bad financial decisions the company made. But in terms of the engineering and operations, Dome was an extraordinary organization. And I learned a lot about common sense leadership from those people. Later in my time at Fletcher Challenge, there was a remarkable man, Hugh Fletcher, that was one of the most thoughtful chief executives of any company that I've been involved with. And I learned a lot just by watching the way Hugh and his senior executive team went about running that very large global company. So I think we develop these skills over time. A lot of it's just common sense. A lot of it is maintaining a very close connection to the people in the organization. And a lot of it is about decision quality. People think about leadership as assembling a team and motivating the team and driving the team to the highest possible level of performance. But there's also a big element of decision quality there that people often overlook. And I think that leaders who consistently make good decisions on behalf of the organization will earn the respect and the loyalty and the hard work of those other people in the company. So I think those are some of the elements, but I'd have to confess that most of what I've learned about leadership, I learned by watching some great leaders over time.
You talked about watching the leaders around you and good decision making, and as a student leader, I'm surrounded by many new and future leaders. I was wondering if you could give me and the audience some advice on how to empower those leaders or impress upon interpersonal and leadership skills, or even encourage them to get out of their shell and become leaders and make those wise decisions.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge because there are some people who have natural inspiring leadership capabilities, but I guess in the extreme, don't know what they're doing. Other people who are experts in their field, but are not naturally inclined to assume a leadership role. And I've run into many extremely capable and smart people in my career who really did not want to take on the challenge of leadership. Myself, I never particularly aspired as a young engineer to be a corporate leader. My interest was more in advancing some of the technologies, successfully executing some interesting projects, getting things done efficiently, and running a great operation. It just sort of became a slippery slope. I went from one thing to another until be darned if I wasn't a vice president somewhere. That was never really my plan. It just happened. So I think we can inspire people to take on the challenge of leadership. If we set reasonable expectations, provide the right encouragement, the right training, and help people develop those skills. I think most people can do it. They just have to grit their teeth and get after it.
On that slippery slope that led you from one thing to the next, eventually you were led to founding the Business Council of Alberta and are currently the chair. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about that and how it came together and what the mission of that organization is.
Yeah, that's interesting. The Business Council of Alberta came about because two very wise men, Mac Van Willigen and Ron Mannix, were drinking coffee and thinking about what could we possibly do to change the narrative, to change the direction of discussion, and to reduce the level of tension that exists between Alberta and Ottawa in a very tough period for the energy sector. And they were very interested not just in maximizing the profits of corporations in Alberta, but creating greater prosperity for the broad base of people in this great province. And, you know, that has really been what's worked so well in Alberta because we have successful energy companies and manufacturing companies that supply energy companies and many support services that are very important to the industry. That has created broad prosperity down through all levels of society here in Alberta. And that's what Ron and Mac were really focused on. And I had the great opportunity to drink a few more cups of coffee with Ron and Mac, and we talked about how we could get this going and what kind of an organization we could put together that would try to support and stimulate broader economic prosperity for all Albertans. And when we talked about prosperity, it wasn't just a larger check at the end of every month, but also what can we do to create greater social prosperity, cultural prosperity, just a better, more functional, more capable, more rewarding society from top to bottom in Alberta. And that sounds like a pretty lofty objective, and it was a lofty objective, but that's what we continue to work for. And we're just very delighted that we've had such strong support from almost 100 corporations in Alberta that have joined the Business Council. And I would say we've had great support from the government of Alberta. We often provide advice to the government of Alberta that they sometimes don't want to hear, and we sometimes get feedback from the government that is not consistent with where we're trying to go. But I'd say on balance, the government of Alberta has been very supportive and collaborative, and we work very well with them. It's more challenging to get our message across in Ottawa. There are other parties in Ottawa that are much closer to the federal government than we are, coming in from the hinterlands out here in Western Canada. But that's an area that we've got to keep working on and keep driving and influencing the national government, part of what I talked about in my remarks today.
It sounds like you've made a lot of great strides within Alberta and within Canada. And we have a question from the audience once again related to this. How do we get this very important message through to Canada's federal government and the U.S. president-elect? And I think the message they're talking about is that we are the best, the cleanest, and the most responsible energy industry in the world.
You know, it's not a marketing message. It's conveying the facts of the situation. And there's been so much misinformation put out there that if we can deliver a logical and cohesive argument to the government of Canada, and also then, because we're in a North American industry and a North American environment, to the government in the United States, that's what we can do and that's what we have to do. And I look today at, for example, my former company, TC Energy, and how persistent they've been. It's probably a curse that I left on TC Energy when in 2008 we dreamed up the idea of Keystone XL at about 9 o'clock in the evening in my office, myself and 3 other people working on that project. You know, it was just about the most logical project you could think of, connecting North America's largest long life source of crude oil production at the oil sands with the largest heavy oil refining complex, the largest refining complex of any kind on Earth in the U.S. Gulf Coast. And we saw that if we followed a more or less straight line, we'd go through what is about the easiest pipeline terrain anywhere in the world. This is not like building through the Rocky Mountains of British Columbia. It's not like crossing the Andes 3 times, which TransCanada had done. This is building through Saskatchewan over and over and over again until you get to Texas. And so we just thought it was a really sensible, winning, logical, highly economic, very attractive project. What we didn't realize is that the activist community had become aware that we had 176 billion barrels of proven oil reserves in the oil sands, and their view was at all costs, we've got to keep that oil in the ground and not produce it. So those are the kind of challenges we ran into on that project. I think as my former TC Energy colleagues go about trying to get that pipeline built today, I think one of the things they need to do is bring the refining community down in Texas to the table, because those refiners really need the kind of oil we produce. They used to get heavy oil from Venezuela, no more. They used to get a lot of heavy oil from Mexico. That's down dramatically. They're counting on oil from Canada's oil sands to balance the blend that goes into these very sophisticated refineries. I think we need to bring Indigenous groups to the table, and TC Energy is doing that. They're talking to Indigenous groups about becoming partners in the Keystone XL pipeline. And I think we can do a lot to clarify for the U.S. government just what progress has been made in terms of environmental achievement and compliance here in Western Canada. Those are the kind of stories I think we've got to get out, and it takes a lot of time in Washington, D.C., and a lot of time in Ottawa, and a lot of time talking to groups in places like Toronto and Montreal, New York and Chicago. But that's what we have to do. It's all about communication at the end of the day, because we've got a good story to tell. We just have to get it out there.
I think we have a great story. Another question, what were the largest challenges and successes you experienced as the head of the Nature Conservancy?
So just to be clear, I was the board chair of the Nature Conservancy. A great fellow, John Lowndes, was the president. He was really the head of the Nature Conservancy. And I mention that because right about now, John Lowndes is retiring after a very successful run as the head of that organization. I think the most rewarding and biggest successes that we achieved at the Nature Conservancy were in fact right here in Alberta. From Waterton, close to the U.S. border, all the way up to Canmore, the Nature Conservancy has conserved hundreds of thousands of acres of lands on the eastern slopes of the Canadian Rockies that provide really important corridors and conduits for grizzly bears, for elk, for other large animals. And we did all of that by raising money from Canadians from coast to coast, and more money raised in Alberta per capita than anywhere else in Canada. And we don't, the Nature Conservancy, by design, never intervenes and never objects to projects that companies are trying to do. When we identify good conservation opportunities, we raise money and we buy the land, or we buy a conservation easement that protects that land in perpetuity. And this is not a small business. The Nature Conservancy of Canada raises and invests almost $100 million a year. People are shocked when they hear that number. I have just finished my latest assignment with that organization. I've been the co-chair of a 5-year fundraising campaign that we just concluded, and we raised $760 million. And interestingly, by far, the largest per capita amount was raised right here in Alberta in the middle of an ongoing economic downturn. So it goes to show you that Canadians really do support environmental conservation. I think it shows you that the Nature Conservancy is on the right track. And I was just very grateful to be part of that for about 15 years.
Makes me very proud of Canadians and especially Albertans to hear that.
Yeah.
You spoke in your discussion about how forward-looking engineers should pursue careers in leadership in the energy industry, and we have a question from the audience speaking to that. It's from students specifically. Do you believe that engineers make good leaders to be pushing for continued development of oil and gas?
Well, yeah, I do. I think that engineers make good leaders primarily because they know what they're talking about. I don't think engineers would be good leaders in areas where they have no background or expertise or knowledge. And I might observe that many politicians today who are leaders actually don't have that expertise. So I think it would be very helpful if more engineers would take up the challenge of leadership. Now, in terms of continuing ongoing development of oil and gas, I'm not coming from the camp where I say we must produce oil and gas at all costs. What I'm saying is if the world is continuing to consume oil and gas, Canada should aggressively compete to get a large share of that oil supply and that natural gas supply, not just because it's in our economic interest, but also because we do it better than almost anywhere else on Earth. Even in the United States today, the amount of solution gas that is flared off in the Permian and in the North Dakota Bakken fields, that's simply not acceptable in Canada. We don't do that kind of thing here. You're not allowed to flare those kind of volumes. And so, I think we run a very high-level industry in terms of the environment, in terms of social inclusion, and in terms of strong governance of our companies. And I think engineers, with the knowledge they bring and what I've seen in the oil industry in particular, there's a very large percentage of leaders in that industry that come from an engineering background. So I think it all comes together pretty well, but more and more engineers need to be motivated to take on the challenge.
I couldn't agree more. And we have a question that lines up with that on tips on leading as an engineer. So the question goes, engineers don't make up entire communities. How do we sway perspectives when communication and effective conversation aren't concepts we learn in school or at work?
Well, I think first of all, communication and effective conversation are concepts that we should learn at school. We should learn them at work, and we should learn them in whatever way we can. Because to be an effective communicator just makes such a huge difference no matter what you're pursuing in life. So I don't think engineers should accept for a moment that they can't be effective communicators. I think they can be very effective. So I think we have to be committed to doing that. I think also, though, we need to recognize that say where I come from, in the oil and gas industry, there's all kinds of engineers, and we all think like engineers, and engineering drives a lot of where we go. Less so across Alberta as a whole. So we have to be understanding, and we have to be committed and careful to making sure we get the message out properly. And when you go across Canada, if there aren't that many petroleum engineers in Alberta, there are virtually none in the rest of the country. So I think we have to be respectful of that and recognize that not everyone has the same background in this business, in this industry that we do here.
For sure. Looks like we have time for one last question from the audience. Even if we have resources that could last for the next 100 years, how does that square with our need to drastically reduce the amount of CO2 we are throwing into the atmosphere? Alberta is an energy leader. Wouldn't the bright minds be better used to figure out how we could better share the vast renewable resources like hydroelectric power than trying to extract more greenhouse gases?
I think that's a logical thing for Alberta to aspire to and for Canadians to aspire to. But, today the world consumes 100 million barrels a day of crude oil. That crude oil is going to come from somewhere, and that production is not going to stop in the next 5 years. So as long as there is demand for crude oil and natural gas, I think it's a great opportunity for us to supply as much of that global market as we can, to do so in the most responsible way that we can, and over time to play a key role in the transition to other forms of energy. That, I think, is the opportunity for us, and that, I think, is what we should focus on.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Hal. That concludes this year's Hantho Lecture on Responsible Leadership. I especially loved the conversations on the roles engineers can play in leading our province and society and being part of the primary driving industry, the energy industry. Many thanks to Chuck Hantho for your vision and philanthropic support. Thank you, Hal. I called you a trailblazer at the beginning of the event, and the origin of the word trailblazer comes from those who hiked the backcountry and made markings on trees to guide the way. Hal, you are a trailblazer. I look forward to following your footsteps, and I hope many of our engineering students join me. Many thanks for your participation. This recording will be available online shortly. Have a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you.